Reformed Church.
Passover has been something, and it's just something that the Lord had just been putting on my mind so much. We were away for a week, and it didn't matter which day it was. It was just Passover, man, on my mind. Passover on my mind, and it is such a magnificent thing. Like, when you just think about it, like when you think Passover, always think about it as two words. I think when you think about it as one word, all you think is holiday, right? Jewish holiday, right? But think of it as two words, Passover, right? Like something they're acknowledging in the Jewish religion, and we acknowledge as Christians, as people that have been saved, right? That there is something that passes over now. Something that passes over. Now, I don't believe that from a Jewish person's perspective, they're not looking at it as something that passes over. I think they're looking at it as something that passed over their ancestors, right? Not something that currently today passes over them, right? But the interesting thing about this is, the thing that fascinates me, one of the things that fascinates me is that is one of the major Passover and what they call Shabbat, which is the Sabbath, right? Those are the two major things, and there are others, right? But they are, like, in other words, the things that are major Jewish observances are major, huge boulders of Christianity, right? Huge boulders of Christianity. Like the celebration, let me put it to you this way. The celebration of Passover would be nothing without the lamb's death, right? Nothing. Without having a sacrificial lamb, right, the Passover to them would mean nothing. Because God put, and I'll read it to you out of Exodus, the condition that God put, the condition that he put upon the initial Passover is that the blood in other words, there had to be a sacrifice in order for there to be blood. So they had to, by obligation, the Lord said, the only way that the death angel will not kill the firstborn in your household is if you take the blood of the sacrificial lamb and put it on the doorpost and the lintel of your door, right, of that household. It is the only way that it'll happen. So without a sacrificial lamb, there was no Passover for them, right? There would be no Passover for them. So it had to be a lamb. So listen to this carefully for a second, right? It had to be a life for a life. It had to be a life for a life. And I'll show you that for a second. And we talk about that in a second. I'll show you the scripture, but we talk about it today, or have heard about it, as an eye for an eye, right? But the significance of an eye for an eye is because it needed to be a life for a life. Right? And I'll show you that in a moment. But it's interesting that it had to be the life that Passover lamb signified, right? In order for a life, right, in that household to be saved. Otherwise, without the significance of that blood, without God seeing that a life had been given, the significance of the life having been given, their firstborn would have died in every Jewish household. But then it's a little bit more important than that also, right? It's not even just that the lamb had to be slaughtered, but the lamb had to, by obligation, be eaten before any of them could be saved. It had to be eaten with, and this is not a small thing, with none left over. In other words, there could be no preservation of life, right? The lamb had to be killed. It needed to be slaughtered. The blood put on their doorposts, and all of that lamb eaten, and any that could have been left over needed to be burned with fire. The same fire that burned and roasted that animal in the beginning had to be the thing to finish it, but it had to be completed. Otherwise, there would be no salvation, right? It had to be completed, right? It had to be completely done. So it needed to be a life for a life, and there could be nothing left over. Nothing left over. Let me show you that. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse number 1, and there is, I'm sure, many things. I mean, I was just looking at things. There's a lot of things in here. I'm not going to pretend to know everything that's in here, but Exodus chapter 12, verse number 1, it says, now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, it says, in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be your beginning of months. And it is an interesting thing that there, which I didn't know, it's not essential to our conversation, right? But there's a Jewish religious calendar, and then there's another Jewish calendar, right? And it's funny that the Jewish religious calendar begins here. In other words, it begins with the Passover, right? It says it would be their beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. So the religious Jewish calendar actually begins with Passover. But not every Jewish person, right, observes it that way, because there's another Jewish calendar, quote unquote, that doesn't begin. It begins with some other thing. I forget exactly right now. It escapes me. But it's an awesome thing that obviously the significance of this lamb we know is Jesus, right? And there's a ton of things that show you the symbolism of this as far as Jesus is concerned. But the cool thing is that it would be that the one thing that has the greatest significance of Jesus Christ, right, as far as being our Passover lamb, right? And even that lamb was called the Lord's Passover, right? It was called the Lord's Passover. But anyway, the fact that would be a beginning of a year for them, right? A beginning of the year, that the coming of Christ would change time for us from BC to AD, and that even from a Jewish perspective, it would mark the beginning of a year for them, right? It's just stuff like that it's just amazing to me. Just such a cool thing. But it says, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. It says, speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father. And it says, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count, it says, for the lamb. Verse number 5, then it says, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. It says, now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And I just leave this to opinion right now, but I believe the significance there of twilight is as the sun was setting, as the sun was beginning to set, which would actually mark the beginning of the Passover, which is what they were celebrating here. What was being instituted by this. Obviously, they didn't have the Passover yet, as far as I know. This was actually the beginning of it. And they shall take some of the blood, in verse number 7, and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the house, so the two sides and on the bottom of the door frame, where on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. So it couldn't just be like they ate the lamb somewhere else, right? And then they went home and then they marked, right, the doorpost and the lintel of the house that they were living. They needed to be in the house where they ate it, right? And in that house is where they would mark the blood. I mean, obviously for us, that's understandable, right? Because we are the house of the Lord, right? And we are the ones that have been washed by the blood, by the death of Jesus Christ, right? I don't know that the definition of blood in every instance is death, but you know that when it's talking about blood in this context, it means the death, the sacrificial death of that lamb. And when it talks about the blood of Jesus, it's talking about the death of Jesus, not some kind of ointment that we put on ourselves, right? So verse number 7 says, and they shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorpost, on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted with fire, with unleavened bread. It is an interesting thing. I don't know. I haven't put these things together, but there's a lot of ideas in my mind rolling around about the unleavened bread and the lamb, right? Because when Jesus talks about the leaven of the Pharisees, he's talking about doctrine. So the fact here that it's just an interesting thing that I'm not even going to try to touch right now, that he's talking about the lamb and then he's talking about unleavened bread. And to me, it's just the teaching of the gospel, but it's just an interesting mixture that he makes there in verse number 8, that you eat the lamb roasted in fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Verse number 9, do not eat it raw nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head and its legs and its entrails. He says, you shall not let, this is verse number 10, it's just very important. You shall not let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. That is a little bit confusing to me, just the wording there. I don't believe that he's saying don't leave it till morning, but if you forget and leave it until morning, then burn it in the morning. I believe what he's saying there, and I'll say it as opinion, that I believe what he's saying there is do not leave it until morning, right? And if there's any left over that you would have left over till morning, burn it. Right? I don't think he's saying don't leave it till morning, but then if you do, it's okay, then just burn it. That doesn't sound like the Lord to me. So I think that's what he's saying there. He says, you shall not let any of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn it with fire. And thus, verse number 11, it says, you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. It says, so you shall eat it with haste. It is the Lord's Passover. And then he says, so if you do that, this is what will happen. Verse number 12, it says, for I will pass through the land of Egypt. So not pass over the land of Egypt, but I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment, right? And obviously he's executing judgment upon Pharaoh and that land because of the children of Israel, right? Because of their treatment of the children of Israel, right? So because of them is why they were Pharaoh and the firstborn of the land were being judged. He says, I am the Lord. He says, now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, or when I see that sacrificial death, when I see that life has been given, I will pass over you. When I see that a life, in other words, when I see that life has been given, you will have life, right? It's life for life, right? When I see a life that has been given, you receive life, right? Because of the sacrificial life of the lamb that has been given, you will have life, right? It says, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So obviously there is a ton there. In verse number 13 again, it says, now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So obviously the beautiful thing there that you see is that as Jesus Christ as being the life that was given for us, right? We have life. It is life for life, right? It is life for life. So because it was our death that he died, right? He gave up his life, right? So because it was our death that he died, we receive his death, but we do receive his life. In other words, that's why you see it, I think it's in Romans 6, in Romans at least, you see them both talked about simultaneously, because you don't receive one without the other. You receive death when you receive the Spirit of God, and you receive life both at the same time, right? Because what you're receiving is, right, the death of Jesus Christ, right? You believe, you put faith in the fact that Jesus died and he was dying your death. So therefore, in essence, then, you have died the death that you were obligated to, right? Why? Because he died your death. So it has always been appointed for men to die once. But because he died our death, right, then obviously that's why we're able to receive life. It is life for life. Let's go to look at Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21 and verse number 22. 21, 22. Exodus 21, 22. It says, if men fight and hurt a woman with child, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows. In other words, the baby is not harmed when the child is born. He shall surely be punished according as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, in other words, if the child is harmed, or the child is stillborn in effect, right? Then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So essentially, he's talking about, right, life for life. If you take, if a child, under the law, right, if you harm the child and the child dies, then someone else has to die, right? It's a life for life. Right? If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned. So he gives examples there, obviously, about how if something causes death to a person, right, then that person needs to die. So it was always like this just punishment for something that was done to another, right? In Matthew, though, in Matthew chapter 5, and verse number 38, Matthew chapter 5, verse number 38, he says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also." So the reason why the Lord addresses, right, the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, right, is because under the law, there were still, right, we were still appointed, right? We were still appointed to death, right? Because Christ had not died yet. So the concept of there being justice for someone else's death, right, could still stand under the law, right? But after Christ has traded his life and given us life, right? In other words, he took our death in order to give us life. That is what impacts what Jesus is saying. In other words, there is nothing that has occurred between the time of the law and the time that Jesus is saying this, apart from the fact that he's prophetically speaking about his death, right? So he is including the death that he would die on the cross in the way that he's now changing. In other words, because of the fulfillment in his death, he could change now and say, this is how this can truly be. This is how it should be, right? So he cites that he's saying it's no longer an eye for an eye. In other words, that you have to give, someone has to repay you like for like, right? In other words, if someone kills, whether it be accidental or not, then someone else has to die that death, right? Why? Because it all goes back to the death of Jesus Christ, right? In other words, the death that he died on the cross, he died for the sins of the world, right? So any sin, any wrong that anyone would ever commit, right, it doesn't need to go back to God. And if you go back to the justice of God is Jesus Christ now, right? It doesn't go back to a law, right? It goes back to the justice of Jesus Christ, right? So So the contrast between obviously Exodus 21 and Matthew chapter 5 is that the lamb, right, has already been slain. In other words, the death that needed to occur in order for that law to be fulfilled, right, has already happened. Therefore, we know how we can look at the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, even though sometimes people still quote that today as though it's like still a Christian concept, right? That's why, can I tell you something? That's why when you look at like the Bible and how it's taught here at the church, and maybe how other religions look at their sacred book, right? To them, it's anything that's written in there is up to be believed. Anything written in there is for them to take, right? But for us, it's our sacred book, right? The Bible. What it's doing is really testifying about Jesus Christ, right? It's not like we read, well, doesn't the Christian Bible say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, so therefore that's why we believe that? Well, but the point is, that's number one, it's under the law, and number two, right, we're looking at the testimony of Jesus Christ in the things that are written in the Bible, not things for us to follow, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, right? So there's a huge difference between the way you look at Scripture and you see God testifying about his Son versus looking at it like, still, unfortunately, many Christians even look at it as though it's just a manual on how we ought to live, right? Because obviously that's how the world sees, or that's how cults look at their sacred writings, right? But that's not how we look at the Bible. We don't look at the Bible as a manual for us on how to live, right? We look at it as something that testifies about Jesus Christ, and he's the one that we're coming to know, right? He's the one that we're coming to know. So you know what? If we go back to in Exodus, you don't have to go back, but I'm just going to read it for you out of Exodus chapter 12 and verse number 13. Again, it says that the blood will be a sign for them on the houses where they are, on the houses where they were. And it says, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. You know, the interesting thing about reading in Exodus, you know, this kind of just reminded me that the Lord says that they had to eat it. They had to eat it in that house. They had to mark the doorpost and the lintel with the blood of that sacrificial lamb, and they had to make sure that everything was finished, that everything was eaten, right? And if everyone had sufficient, right, then it needed to be burned, right, to be able to be disintegrated, if you will, right? The cool thing, when you look at that in contrast of John chapter 6, let me bring you there real quick. John chapter 6 and verse number 53. You see, it says, Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you that unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh, is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me, right, it says, will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever. There's a couple cool things there at the end that I'll share with you in a moment, but it's cool to see here, right, that he talks about himself, right, the same way that the Passover lamb is spoken of, right, the same way that they had to eat the flesh of the Passover lamb, right, and they had to utilize the blood. He speaks about himself the same way. You have to eat the flesh of the Son of Man. So it's cool to see that the significance of the symbol of them eating the lamb, right, was faith in Jesus Christ, right? In other words, they could have just taken the lamb, killed it, taken the blood, you know, put it over their doorpost, and then eaten chicken, right? Why did they have to eat the lamb? Maybe they didn't like lamb. Maybe they could just eat chicken. But it wasn't about just eating any old thing. It wasn't just about them having dinner, right? It was that the significance of them eating that lamb, right, on the day before they would be saved, if they did what God prescribed to them, right? It was the eating of the lamb that why the death angel would pass over them. In other words, they were being saved by eating the lamb, right? And the symbol of the blood of that lamb, right, which is the death of Jesus Christ, right? I don't know about you, it blows my mind to think. It's such a cool thing to think. When a Jewish person is sitting down for their Passover and they're eating lamb, they're talking about faith in Jesus Christ. That's what they're speaking about in what they're doing. I mean, they don't know that that's what they're doing, right? But that's essentially what they're doing. Now, they may think in their mind they're commemorating the fact of what God did, right? But God was testifying about what he was going to do, not about what he did. He did what he did, right, in the way that he did it, sure, to save them, but it was for them to be able to receive actual salvation. In other words, them being saved from Pharaoh and being released as being slaves, right, it's just a carnal benefit a carnal benefit of the salvation that God would bring thousands of years after, right? It was the same way as if today we experience physical healing, right? We don't celebrate physical healing. We celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We celebrate the fact of the glory that we possess. We celebrate everything that he gave, right? It's just, of course, there are physical, tangible benefits. Prosperity in your finances is a physical, tangible benefit of the cross, right? But the cool thing is it all goes back to what Jesus Christ finished, right? There could be none left over. Listen, if that household, let's say, for instance, they ate the lamb, they put the blood on the doorposts, but they saved some of the lamb over because they didn't have a lot of money, and they ate the lamb in the morning also. That household would not be saved, right? That household would have had the firstborn die. What God prescribed, they had to follow all of it, right? They had to follow all of it, exactly like he said. But what is the importance of that, right? What is the importance of each of those three elements, right? The lamb had to be killed, the blood of the lamb had to be put on their doorposts, right? And none could be left over. None could be left over. That's a thing we keep coming back to, right? None could be left over. Take a look at you know what? Let me just see here for a second, and this might just be something for later. I'm just going to take a look real quick at something. 2 seconds here. Yeah, I'm going to definitely save that for later. Take a look at Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34, and look at verse number 25. It says, "You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven." It says, "Nor shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover be left until morning." Right? So I wanted to reemphasize that to you again, because I'm going to read two things here. That was Exodus 12 and Exodus 34. Both of them make reference to the fact that none of the lamb could be left over until morning, right? That's also going to ring a bell for you. Look at Exodus chapter 16 now, right? And we'll kind of start putting this together a little bit. Exodus chapter 16, and look at verse number 18. Right? There were two other things, right? If you start thinking about it, two other things that could not be left until morning, right? One of them was the meat of the Passover lamb is one. Exodus chapter 16 gives us another one. It says, "So when they measured it by omers," they were talking about gathering the manna. It says, "He who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's need. And Moses said, let no one leave any of it until morning," right? Same exact thing. You could take all of the manna that you wanted, but do not leave any of it until the morning, right? Leave none of it, he said, until the morning. Now, with the lamb, it was the flesh of the Passover lamb, right? Here, right, it's the bread, the manna, right? And we know that both of them, which is just, again, it's just an amazing thing how loudly, right, when you can see it, right, when you know the Lord, when you acknowledge him, how loudly you see Jesus being testified of, right? Because Jesus is, right, the bread of life, right? He is the Passover lamb, but he's also the bread of life. And in both instances, the Lord says the exact same thing. Do not leave any of it until morning. Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and it stank, right? It says, and Moses was angry with them, so they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need. And when the sun became hot, it melted. And so it was the sixth day. It says that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. It says, then he said to them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest." So in the case of the Passover lamb, it wasn't the Sabbath, right? It was the Passover, right? Here, so that's the body of the Passover lamb. That was the Passover. Here it's the bread, and it's not the Passover now, but now it's the Sabbath, right? Very interesting, right? But he says, tomorrow is a Sabbath rest. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to keep it until morning. So here for the Sabbath, he says, okay, now you can leave it until morning. So before, right, the 6 days symbolizing work and labor, don't leave it till morning, because that's symbolizing, right, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, right? But then for the Sabbath day, right? For the Sabbath day, now it's okay to leave it, right? Because that's talking about the provision of Jesus Christ, right? But he says it's okay to leave it until morning then. So they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded, and it didn't stink, nor were there any worms in it, right? So he says, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will find it in the field. The cool and very, very interesting thing that you'll see here, and we'll read it later, is that the day before, the day of preparation that I was talking to you about a few messages ago, right? The day of preparation that Jesus Christ was killed on, right, was before both days, right? It was a Sabbath and the Passover on the same day it fell, right? And obviously it doesn't always fall on that. We know that for sure, right? But the day that Christ died was a day of preparation before both of them. Why? Because he is our Sabbath rest, right? And he is also our Passover lamb. So meaning that we have life and death passes over you, right? We have life from the bread of life, right? Bread meaning life, and we have death having no longer any dominion over us, right? It's just a very, very cool thing. In John chapter 19. John chapter 19. John chapter 19 and verse number 30. John chapter 19, 30. It says, so when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. It is finished. And here's just the awesome significance of that, right? It is finished, and you'll see it play out in how it happens to him, right? But it is finished means it was done. It was complete. In other words, there was nothing left over. There was no preservation of life, right? There was nothing kept back, right? Everything was done. It was complete. It was finished, right? None left over, right? Everything that needed to be done was done. It is finished, he said. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. Now, everything that happens here happens just to substantiate the fact that it's finished. He said, therefore, because it was the preparation day, the day that he died, he said that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, right? They didn't want, I mean, in their estimation, they because of their custom, they said, well, the Sabbath is coming, therefore the body of Jesus cannot stay there, right? The awesome thing about that, right, is that it couldn't, right? It couldn't remain there. In other words, Jesus could not have lived past, right, the beginning of the Sabbath, right? He had to have died in order for there to be a Sabbath. In order for there to be a Passover, he had to completely be dead. So much so that you'll see in a second that when they talked to Pilate, he was amazed. It says that he was already dead. In other words, with the speed with which it happened, he was amazed that he had already died, right? It says, I mean, this doesn't mean everything, right? But the two that were next to him were still alive, right? Therefore, they had to break the knees of those men, right, in order so that they would finish dying. By the time they got to Jesus, he was already dead, right? He was already dead because why? Because it was finished. It had to be complete. It had to be a totality of a work. His labor had to be totally done. In order for what? In order for there to be a Sabbath. See, there would be no Passover without a sacrificial lamb. There is no such thing as the initial Passover would not have been instituted without the death of that lamb, without the blood on the doorpost, right? And without it being incinerated before the morning. There would be no Passover, right? It is the same way with us, right? There is no such thing as death passing over us. I mean, I could understand any skepticism with any person that would not believe that we have eternal life, right? If Christ had not have finished everything, right? In other words, if there was anything still that needed to be done, left over, some work, something left incomplete, something not quite left done, then I would totally understand that there's skepticism on the point of any Christian, right? But the fact that we know that every single thing that we believe, everything that a Christian stands for, every doctrine that the Lord has taught us, right? Everything that we hold to goes back, right, to the finished work of Jesus Christ, right? Because without it, there's nothing. It needed to be entirely complete. See, in my mind, when I hear nothing left over, bells are going off in my head. Bells going off in my mind, right? Why? Because everything is done. Anything that any Christian could believe about anything, prosperity, faithfulness, goodness in their life, the love of God, anything, right? All of that means nothing without the work being finished, right? If there's anything that he left undone, then there is cause of skepticism somewhere for some person, right? But there is nothing, not even the second coming of Jesus Christ is doing anything to accomplish anything for anyone. We're just seeing fully. It is finished is not just these three words that sound really cool when you say it with an exclamation. It is finished is everything is done. If they would have left, listen, a morsel of that lamb, a little piece this big, not incinerated, left on the table or on the plate of a person, that household, the firstborn, would have died because they left a piece this big. Listen, a piece big enough for a mouse to eat, right? Would have negated that household. Why? Because there was some preservation, right? Something was not finished, right? It needed to be incinerated, right? Gone, done, completely finished, right? Nothing. It was the same thing with the manna, right? They could have just left a little bit of the manna, a little bit of the manna for the next day, right? It would have stank. It would have bred worms, right? It's the same exact thing with the death, the completed, finished work and labor of Jesus Christ. That's why he says, I have called you to reap where you have not sown. I and my Father have already labored, and I have called you to enjoy that labor. In other words, for us to really celebrate. And you know what? I know this doesn't quite hit us like this very much, but we should be people that know how to celebrate. Like Christians should be people that know how to party, right? Why? Because we are the only ones on the entirety of this planet that have a reason to party, right? Everybody else has reason to sorrow, but we have no reason to sorrow. Why? Because everything is finished. Why, Pastor Jose, shouldn't I grieve the death of a loved one? Because he finished death. He finished it. What could ever happen to me that should be a formidable thing that I should say I have reason to sorrow? If there is even a little bit of reason why I have to sorrow, then he didn't finish it. Now, I know that Christians today, including myself, you may grieve or feel guilt when you shouldn't because of your lack of knowledge, but it doesn't mean that he didn't give you a reason not to sorrow and a reason not to grieve, right? It's just that we don't know. And when we don't know, it leads to things like guilt, sorrow, condemnation, envy, strife, all types of things going on in your mind. But it's not because he didn't rid you of it, right? It's just that sometimes we don't acknowledge the Lord to the depth of what he's done. He finished everything. Literally everything. Like there is nothing that God or Jesus Christ is going to do, right, to add anything else to your life. Nothing that they could do. Why? Because it is all finished. Like, when you hear that, not even a little bit of the manna could be left over. Not even a little bit of the meat of the lamb could be left over. And for Jesus to say, he said, it is finished. Bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. Verse number 31, therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. You know, I don't know this for sure, but I think it's even a cool thing that they didn't help him die, right? That he gave up his spirit himself, right? He gave up his spirit himself, and he died, himself died. In other words, he said, I'm finishing it. Nobody finished the work for him. He finished the work. Even with all of the bruises, even with all of the slashes, even with all the beatings, right? The power of God was enough to heal him completely and sustain him forever, right? He chose to die, right? He chose to take our death, right? He chose to take our death. It's such an important thing to see. He chose to take our death, right? He said, therefore, because it was the preparation day, again in verse 31, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and the other who was crucified with him, right? With Jesus. But when they came to Jesus and they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you may believe. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled, not one of his bones shall be broken. And again, another scripture says, it says, they shall look on him whom they have pierced. Let me just see real quick. Yeah, it says, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body of Jesus, and Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloe. And you know, it's interesting. It may have been, I don't know if it was a different account of this, but I could even find it for you after service. But there is most definitely an account that says that Pilate was, I don't know if it says surprised, but that he was like, he made a point of saying like, oh, like he's already dead. But anyway, it wasn't right here, but I can definitely find it for you after service. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, verse 39, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloe, about 100 pounds. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jew is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So there they laid Jesus, because the Jews' preparation day for the tomb was nearby. Okay, so the beautiful thing that I want you to see there is like when the Lord said it is finished, how every single thing, even after his death, still the things that were happening, his bones not being broken, him having died, right, just in time, being taken down from the cross, like just that the whole reason why the Jews even, I don't know if that was a command of God. I don't know this at all, whether God commanded that should never happen. I believe that was maybe part of the law, that they couldn't have a dead man or a cursed man on the cross on the day of the Sabbath, right? But just the fact that was a law that they observed, right? That the only reason why that law would be given, the only reason, is just so that we could say today that nothing was left undone, that everything was finished prior to the Sabbath and prior to the Passover. That we can in our heart and in our mind celebrate both the passing over of death over us, the passing over of death, right? and be able to celebrate the fact that we have received life, right? That the bread of life, right, is ours, right? That the fact, listen, the fact that we, even as it relates to the Sabbath, right? As it relates to the manna, it's our life, right? As it relates to the sacrificial lamb of the Passover, right? It's death passing over us. But then as it relates to the Sabbath, right? That is the reason why we can rest, is because all of the labor, in other words, without if even a little bit of what Christ was going to accomplish or had to accomplish for us was not done, you know that we would have reason to say that we should labor. And then again, skepticism should be in the minds of Christians as to, well, if I have to labor here, like what else don't I know that it was undone, was left undone, right? Like I know about this piece that wasn't undone, that wasn't completed, but how about this other piece, right? But the fact that all of the work was finished, so that we could never, ever have to have any skepticism about anything being left undone, so that you would never have to be thinking in your mind, well, yeah, but can I have that? And is this really something that I can have now? Or is this really something that I can receive now? It's done. It is finished. There is never anything that's going to be added to you ever again. And the only way to ever receive, right, is by the knowledge of Jesus, right? The only way to ever receive is by the knowledge of Jesus. Now, I will give you this, right? Why is there some confusion among Christians, apart from the fact that some people are living by what they see with their eyes? But that's a separate thing, right? But why is there seem to be like some skepticism in the minds of people? Like, how do they understand, the difference between, like, can I continue to live now and then receive a resurrected body when I know the Lord fully, right? Like, do I have to die? Or can I just go on for as long as it takes, right? Go on growing in the knowledge of Christ and life working in me all along. Now, still, you could look at it, like I said before, as that, well, death still, I experience pain or hurt somewhere or whatever. But the thing is, the way to really look at it is as you grow in the knowledge of Jesus, life is working in you. So that means it is undoing whatever death is trying to do in your body, in your physical body, right? Life in you is undoing it, right? A little bit at a time, but it is undoing it, right? As you grow a little bit at a time or a lot at a time in your knowledge of Jesus, right? But here's the thing that we do know. We do know, right, that as we growing in the knowledge of Jesus is life to us. It is definitely life to you, right? And that it gives life to you because most Christians that are Bible-believing Christians, right, believe in healing. So that we believe, right, we believe that you have something that can work in your body and that you could give away. But even with that, some Christians are still skeptical that the same healing life that can work in your body and that you could give away is enough, maybe, is the way they look at it, maybe, right? I don't know how they look at it, but enough maybe to continually sustain you. Over 85. I don't know why they put a limit on old, but whatever seems to be the old age is what seems old enough for people sometimes when they think that way, right? But the reality is, right, that if I live and I have faith in Jesus Christ, that believing, which is that eating, right? When I eat that lamb, it is life to me. So the more I eat, the more life I have. The more I eat, the more life I have. And I can eat as much as I want, right? The loaves proved it. The manna proves it. You can eat as much as you have need of. Eat. Help yourself as much as you want. Are you done? No. Keep eating then. If you're not done, he's not done giving you to eat. Eat as much as you want to eat, right? Eat and eat and eat. But I know that as I eat, it is life to me, right? I know that as I eat, it's life to me. And I also know that a believer that has eaten, right, can die, right? Because maybe they haven't eaten enough. Maybe, in other words, their knowledge is not all there and they can die, right? But the Lord will give even that person, if they're not raised up beforehand, will give them full knowledge. So they will eat fully and he will still raise them up. By the same faith, right? By the same knowledge of Jesus. Let's say it like that, right? By the same knowledge of Jesus. So the reality is that I can eat today and I can go on living if I eat, and if I die, haven't eaten, right, I will still receive fully, right? So I can live both ways. Let me show you how that's actually written. In John 11, I believe. I think it's John 11. Heck, you know what? Actually, that's very good. Before I go there, Pastor Mike just sent me this because I know it is actually Mark 15. It's the account of Mark, and we were reading John, I believe. But in the account of Mark 15:44, it says, "And Pilate marveled if he were already dead, and calling unto him the centurion, he asked whether he had been dead a while or not." So Pilate marveled at the fact that he was dead. So, I'm sure these people, and this is just total opinion, but these people obviously were used to how long does a guy normally hang there before they're dead, right? So there were people that were accustomed to this form of punishment, right, for thieves and for robbers. But it's an interesting thing that he marveled at the fact that he was already dead. So that's very good. So thank you for that. So in John 11 and verse number 25. John 11 and verse number 25. Jesus said to her, he's talking to Mary and Martha, he says, "I am the resurrection and the life," right? I am the resurrection and the life. So let's just stop there for a quick second. That claim, right, that he's the resurrection and the life, how could he be that to you? Because we know how he could be our Passover lamb, right? And we know how we said how he could be our Passover lamb and how he is our bread, right? And how he's our rest, right? But how is he our resurrection and life? The exact same way, right? Because without the work of Jesus Christ being finished, he could not be the resurrection and the life, right? Because there is no life for life, right? We would still then be under the old covenant because no one would have suffered our death, and we could still live under a law that says life for life, right? If anything happens to me, then the justice of God demands, not the law. I mean, there are laws of death penalty. We're not talking about the laws of men. We're talking about the justice of God would be, if somebody kills a family member, then you kill them, right? That's the justice of God. But the justice of God doesn't work like that anymore, right? Obviously there is vengeance that the Lord will take for anyone that tries to harm, but that's the vengeance that God was taking upon the people of Israel against Pharaoh, right? But the law that said in a life for a life, right? That justice has been fulfilled for us, right? A life for a life. So the fact that Jesus gave up his life means that we justly, right, have access to the life of God. Justly have access to the life of God. So in other words, so a person that dies can now be raised up, right? By that same cross, right? So that works in any family member of mine's life, right? So if someone dies in a car accident, we can raise that person up. Right? Now, I know we don't always look at it like that. We look at it as, oh my God, this terrible thing has happened. But yes, it's a bad thing that they went through the experience, but they could still be raised up from the dead, right? In other words, he is our resurrection and life because the work was finished. There was nothing left over. There's no little bit, even an ounce of work that was needed to be done after the fact. Right? That's why he immediately entered into the fullness of his glory, seated at the right hand of the Father, because everything was complete, right? Everything was complete. Therefore, for him to make that claim that for us, he is our resurrection and our life, you go back to the same thing, the same Passover lamb, the same it is finished, right? The same, the knowledge of the fact that nothing was left undone. Like if you could sit there as a Christian and you can say, there is never a reason for me to doubt anything, whether I have it or don't have it, whether it's mine or it's not. It's finished. It's finished. That needs to be enough. That needs to be enough. Like that has to ring true in your mind and fill your heart for you to know, my God, it is really, really finished. And then if it's finished, that lingering thing in the minds of people, can I have it now, right? He answers that, right? Verse 25, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, that means eat, right? He who eats is the symbolism of John 6, right? He who eats, though he may die, he shall live, right? So the living could come from somebody raising him. The living could come from him being raised in the last day. The point is not when he lives. The point is that life is going to come from the same source. The work that was finished on the cross. It is the finished work of Jesus Christ that could raise a person if they die believing, right? If they die having eaten, believing in the Lord, what raises that person is the cross, the finished work of Jesus Christ, right? If they're raised up on the last day, it's the same reason. The reason has not changed. It's just the time, right? It's just the time. The only thing that has changed, either the knowledge of someone, right, that raised that person up, and after that person is raised up, in other words, Lazarus, after having been raised up, if he would have continued in his believing, he didn't have to die. In other words, there's no unwritten law that if you're raised from the dead, well, you still have to die. No. Where are we getting that from? There's only one law, the law of the Spirit of life that is in that Christ on that cross. There's only one law at work here. There's not other laws that say, well, people still have to die, right? If they have a physical body, you still have to die. There's no law that says that anywhere. That's not written anywhere at all, and it's not part of any of God's justice or his equation. He says here, clear as a bell, he said, he who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. But watch now. It says, and whoever lives, that's me and you and every Christian, right? Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. So that covers it all, right? That covers it all. If I live today and continue to believe in the Lord, I will have life working in me. And I have to just keep believing, keep growing in my knowledge of Christ, and I will continue to receive life. The interesting thing is that I could live from now. Let's say Jesus, and I don't think it's going to be that long, but let's say Jesus doesn't come back for another 300 years. I don't think at all that it's going to be that long, but let's say 300 years. I could go on living for 300 years and still not have a heavenly body and still not die, right? Because life is still working in me, and I continue to grow in my knowledge, and I continue to know the Lord, and I continue to believe who he is to me. He is the resurrection, and he is the life, and I continue to grow, and the day that the Lord comes back, any little bit that I'm missing from having received of what I have, I will get, right, when my knowledge is full. But it's so cool to know, listen, there's only one thing that's lacking in our physical mind, and it's just it being renewed, right? It's just knowledge, the knowledge of Jesus, we have it already, right? We have all wisdom already on the inside of us. It's just it renewing our physical mind, your physical mind being renewed to what you already know on the inside of you. It's all that's missing, but it's not anything lacking on the part of the Lord. That's why when we celebrate, and I'll stop here, but when we celebrate the Sabbath, right? You can celebrate the rest that we have been given. In other words, there is real reason for our rest and real reason for the Spirit of God to work everything through you. Like there's good reason for that and reason for us to celebrate that. There is reason for us to celebrate the Passover, right? Reason for us to celebrate the fact that death will constantly pass over you, right? That death is not the thing that has dominion over us, right? None, that there is no dominion, that it's all finished. Thank you, Jesus.
We hope you enjoyed this message from Reformed Church. If you have, please share this with someone else and help us get this uncommon truth out to the world. If you'd like to support this good news, you can do so at reformedchurch.com/give. Also on our website, you can take advantage of our free messages, articles, and even full discipleship courses. Start reforming your mind now at reformedchurch.com.